Lots of countries celebrate their revolutions. The US has Independence Day. The French party on the day they overthrew their king. Many South Americans commemorate Simón Bolívar's revolution to end Spain's rule. So why doesn't Germany celebrate its revolution? More than 100 years ago, the country got rid of its monarchy. It started with a revolt by German sailors who were sick of fighting World War I. Within a few weeks, the German people overthrew the emperor. Why not honor that with a holiday? My name is David Levitz, and in this episode of our series Unmasking Revolutions, we'll get some help from experts to answer that question. Let's introduce them. This is Irish historian Mark Jones.
When the rebellion starts within the Navy, it's a rebellion against the order, social hierarchy, culture, the meaning of monarchy itself. So we will not die for these ideals. And that's really overthrowing the order in the world at this time.
German historian Nadine Rossol.
And the revolution gave an extraordinary voice to ordinary people with the political changes it makes. It allows people to express, men and women equally, to express their political opinion through voting, through being selected for political offices as well.
DW reporter and historian Jaime González Arguedas.
It relates to an era of enormous chaos, in which it was unclear which path would be taken. And above all, it's a revolution that also culminates in bloodshed.
To understand what happened, let's go back to 1918, when Germany was still an empire and about to lose World War I. From denial to defeat. When Russia was defeated and left the war in March 1918, it allowed Germany to move a huge number of soldiers from the east to the Western Front, where Germany was fighting the British, the French, and the newly arriving Americans. For a short time there, German troops outnumbered the Allies. Germany used that advantage to launch a series of attacks known as the Spring Offensive. For months after, the German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and his senior commanders, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, continued to tell Germans they could win the war.
With blazing machine guns, the Yanks held fast and stopped the enemy.
But the reality in the trenches was very different.
Germany's last and greatest offensive had failed.
German morale collapses in July and August 1918, and huge numbers of German soldiers start to surrender. They start to surrender at the highest rates that take place during the First World War as a whole. And so Germany is in this moment of facing military defeat, even though its soldiers are still in French and Belgian territory.
German civilians were exhausted too.
The atmosphere in Germany at the end of the First World War was quite a depressed one, to be frank. People had experienced the war for 4 years by that point, a war that was much longer already at that point than they ever thought it would be, and the costs had become blatantly obvious. Many people had lost loved ones.
And now, after a rapid series of Allied victories, Germany's military was crumbling too. By the end of September, Germany's top military commanders told the Kaiser his empire had lost and that they needed to request an immediate armistice from the Allies. Until then, the war had only been fought outside the German Empire. Now, an invasion of German territory by the Allies seemed inevitable. In the United States, President Woodrow Wilson had already outlined some general principles for peace in a speech he gave to Congress earlier that year. The Germans knew Wilson's so-called 14 points, and they assumed those would be the baseline for negotiations.
And in the 14 points, he says, we will make a new world, a world where nations have the right to self-determination and a world of democracy.
Wilson is not unhappy about starting negotiations with Germany, but says, I want reforms. We're not negotiating with the country we've been at war with for the last couple of years. We want that this country reforms, because before we even start talking about an armistice and then possibly some sort of peace negotiations.
The truth is, Germany had quietly turned into a military dictatorship. Officially, it was still ruled by the Kaiser, but in reality, his top military commanders, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, had been calling the shots for 2 years. But once they realized they'd lost the war, they tried to shift the blame. They wanted to hand over power to a new civilian government that would take responsibility for Germany's defeat and negotiate for peace.
Even though Ludendorff had denied for 2 years that this possibility was viable or above all necessary. And what else does he do? He proposes to the Kaiser that he form a government made up of the very parties that had advocated for a negotiated end to the conflict but had been excluded from power. Namely, the Social Democratic Party, the Left Liberals, and the Catholic Centre Party. And why does he do this? As he himself would later confess, he wants the peace treaty, which he knows will be very harsh, which he knows will cost Germany dearly, to be signed by those parties whom he considers enemies.
In response, the Kaiser appointed a liberal aristocrat as the new chancellor. Prince Max von Baden, who wasn't a member of any party, would go down in history as Germany's last imperial chancellor, the man who oversaw Germany's transition from a monarchy to a republic. On November the 9th, 1918, he transferred power to the Social Democrat Friedrich Ebert. We'll get to that a little later. Now, von Baden's new government immediately sent a note to US President Woodrow Wilson requesting an armistice and peace negotiations. It basically amounted to a capitulation. To avoid further bloodshed, the German government requests the immediate conclusion of an armistice on land, at sea, and in the air. While Germany's new civilian government was taking responsibility for trying to end the war, Germany's military commanders felt they were off the hook. Meanwhile, the war itself just went on.
And in that month of October, each of those weeks, each of those days means men are dying at the front, men are being killed, families are losing their loved ones. And people in Germany are fully aware, our families are losing members in a war that is lost. Our government have announced at the start of October that the war is lost. That's why they sent the peace note. This is very clear to people that the war cannot be won. And so while the government delays the process of making a lost war lost and ending it, people start to think we will have to do this ourselves.
In these first exchanges, Wilson makes it quite clear to the German government that, firstly, peace will not be dictated by Germany, but by the Allies. Secondly, more importantly, Wilson hints that there can be no negotiation with an autocratic monarchy. That in such a case, there can only be surrender, which means he is implicitly suggesting that the Kaiser must abdicate.
In Berlin, Chancellor Max von Baden and his new government were busy transforming the political system into a parliamentary monarchy. They pushed through changes called the October Reforms. From now on, the Chancellor would answer to Parliament, not just to the Kaiser. The Kaiser would become a representative figure with no real power.
The October reforms are actually quite spectacular. They turned Germany into a parliamentary monarchy. They give much more power to Parliament than Parliament ever had before. A new government is created that includes the biggest party, the social representatives of the biggest parties, the Social Democrats, for the first time.
But it still wasn't clear exactly how this new system would work. And World War I still wasn't over. The Navy's last gamble. While all these changes were happening back in Berlin, the Imperial German Navy was doing its own thing. Without approval from the government, it was preparing a massive battle against the British Navy, who were far superior. Germany's navy had failed until now to achieve a single major victory in the war. And Navy leadership wanted to restore their honor with a heroic final battle. They also hoped to break the British blockade of Germany that was causing food shortages. And they thought a dramatic naval victory might prove Chancellor von Baden's peace efforts wrong and give new life to the German war effort. But none of that happened, because German sailors refused to sail to their deaths.
And the sailors refused to do so because they sort of said, that's ridiculous. The war is almost over. And this is, we're not doing any of this.
When the sailors are preparing to sail out and launch the mission, several hundred of them rebel. And several ships, the commanders are no longer in command of their ships. This is a very labor-intensive form of fighting. The ships need coal. Coal needs to be shoveled into the fires. These are people working beneath the surface of the ship in extremely hot, extremely physically demanding conditions. If they stop, the commander isn't able to make the ship move. So that happens on a number of ships, and it causes the naval commanders to panic. And they panic to the extent that they call off the entire operation.
Hundreds of sailors were arrested by naval command. But it was already too late. The mutiny spread rapidly from the port of Wilhelmshaven to the city of Kiel, where it turned into a widespread rebellion. By the beginning of November, the movement had grown to around 20,000 people. Shipyard workers in Kiel declared their solidarity with the sailors and rallied for their release. Party and union members joined the protests. When the revolutionaries met with officials, one of the leaders of the uprising said, "You keep talking about a sailors' revolt. That may have been the case yesterday and the day before, but not today. We are now at the beginning of the German Revolution." And that was true. The spark of revolution had been ignited, and it was unstoppable. Kiel was the first city to be taken over by a soldiers' council. In the next weeks, the same would happen in most German cities. The Powder Keg Explodes. Throughout the empire, massive crowds gathered, demanding peace. They were also calling for the Kaiser to step down, and for the German Empire to be transformed into a democratic republic.
Die Nacht und am Morgen war große Flotte mit Volldampf voraus. In Stürmen und Hosen wir rot.
On November 8th, 17-year-old student Karl Leicht witnessed these demonstrations in the city of Essen. He wrote about them in a school essay. Wherever you went, it seemed that everyone had forgotten the misery of war. There was jubilation and joy everywhere. Bismarckplatz presented an equally moving picture in the afternoon, when the Workers' and Soldiers' Council held a public meeting. Around 10,000 people, almost all of whom were workers, listened intently to the speaker's remarks. It was only on the way home that I had time to think about what was actually going on. Only then did I realize I had witnessed a piece of world history. The old regime had collapsed, and Germany had become a free republic. Now, even though Germany was an empire ruled until now by the Kaiser, there were still a bunch of kings, dukes, and princes ruling their own states under him. But not for long. On November 7th and 8th, revolutionaries in southern Germany proclaimed the Bavarian Republic. King Ludwig III of Bavaria stepped down and fled with his family to Austria. The first German throne had fallen, and others were about to follow. At first, the revolution was fairly peaceful, but there were some casualties.
The rumours that are present in all of the major urban centres where the revolution breaks out are that if the crowd is not successful in overturning the political order, it will be suppressed by a counter-revolution. And even when it's successful, that expectation that the counter-revolution is coming is so strong that it sees people opening fire and firing at inexistent counter-revolutionary officers. And this is actually the main reason why how people are killed in Germany in November 1918 during the revolution. They're shot by revolutionaries who are firing because they think they're being fired upon by counter-revolutionaries, whereas the counter-revolutionaries actually decided not to fight.
Germany was on the verge of becoming a real democracy, but fear still had a big role to play. The Day of Days. On November the 9th, one era ended and a new one began. That morning, the revolution reached the German capital, Berlin. Workers started to strike, and crowds of hundreds of thousands marched toward the city center. They were joined by soldiers, even ones from battalions considered particularly loyal to the emperor.
There is a sense by the political leadership in Berlin at this particular point in time that this is something big and something important. This is something that needs some sort of political leadership, otherwise it might get out of control. So what the, first of all, what Max Prinz von Baden does, who had fairly unsuccessful discussions before with Wilhelm II to suggest he should abdicate and all the rest of it, he declares the abdication of the Kaiser, even though the Kaiser actually hadn't quite agreed to that yet. But he very clearly felt we need to make concessions and we need to actually give people what they want here. Otherwise, we're in trouble.
The Chancellor basically made the decision for the Kaiser, who wasn't even in Berlin. He was at German army headquarters in occupied Belgium. Von Baden then handed over the reins of government to Friedrich Ebert, the leader of the biggest party in parliament, the Social Democratic Party, or SPD. Friedrich Ebert led the moderate wing of the SPD. His primary goals were to restore law and order in Germany and to suppress the radical left. He would head Germany's provisional government from November 1918 to February 1919 and was later the first president of Germany's Weimar Republic until his death in 1925. Up until now, the revolutionary movement didn't have one clear vision of what political system Germany should have, and that was becoming very clear.
Bueno, desde el principio.
From the very beginning of the November Revolution, two possible paths for the revolution enter into competition.
Desarrollos de la revolución. Uno que sería el proyecto.
One is the project of the far left, primarily the USPD and the Spartacist League, which is essentially to achieve a Bolshevik revolution and a Bolshevik solution to the events unfolding in Germany.
A los acontecimientos que se están produciendo en Alemania.
The other project is that of the SPD, which consists of trying to establish a parliamentary, democratic system.
Estos dos proyectos.
These two projects are in competition,
Lo que significa que
which means that both the SPD and the USPD are in continuous competition to try to lead the revolution.
Actually, two different German republics were proclaimed on the very same day of November 9th, 1918. Let's meet the two men who declared these two different republics. The first was SPD politician Philipp Scheidemann, a member of Baden's cabinet. He was the first one to proclaim a German republic on November 9th, and later he served in the provisional government. From February to June of 1919, he was Germany's first Reich minister-president before resigning in protest over the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended World War I. The Second Republic was declared by Karl Liebknecht. He led the radical left, which was against moderate socialists like Scheidemann and Ebert. On November the 9th, he proclaimed a free socialist republic. He was a founder of the Spartacus League and co-founded the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD. On January the 15th, 1919, he was assassinated by members of the Freikorps, a right-wing paramilitary group made up of former soldiers who'd served under the Kaiser. Got it? Okay, so here's what happened. On November the 9th, during his lunch break in the Parliament dining hall, Scheidemann made a quick decision. He'd heard that Liebknecht was going to declare a socialist republic, but he wanted to keep power in the hands of moderates and avoid more chaos. So he beat Liebknecht to the punch. Around 2 p.m., he stepped onto a balcony at the Parliament and proclaimed the German Republic. The speech was recorded by a journalist using shorthand. The German people have triumphed all along the line. The old rottenness has collapsed. Militarism is finished. The Hohenzollerns, that was the royal family, have abdicated. Long live the German Republic.
Resulta realmente curioso que
It's really curious that the declaration of the Republic was due to the spontaneous and unilateral decision of a politician in the middle of a meal. But the truth is that many historical events happen in such unexpected ways.
se producen de este modo tan inesperado.
Immediately afterwards, Ebert had a heated argument with Scheidemann, telling him that the form of government for Germany should be decided by constituent assembly, not by some gentleman before dessert.
Antes de los postres.
About 2 hours later, around 4 p.m., Liebknecht declared his vision for Germany, the Free Socialist Republic. According to some accounts, he made his speech from a window of the royal palace, where the royal family had always given their speeches. Others say he stood on a car. Either way, within hours, the Kaiser was removed, and two competing republics were declared all peacefully, something newspapers at the time remarked on.
The first headline is, they're not shooting, nobody's shooting. This is a surprise to everybody who's there at this time. And the second headline, if you read a newspaper that's loyal or sympathetic to the position of Ebert and Scheidemann and the majority Social Democrats, is clear the streets, go home. We need calm, we need order, we need to work. And if we don't, we will face conditions of famine because our food supply is not secure. Opposite message is in the newspapers, and there's very few of them that are sympathetic to or owned and controlled by the Spartacus group. Their message is stay on the streets, keep the protests going, Don't let them steal the revolution from you.
So at this point, in late 1918, there were two very different messages. Soon the tensions between these political visions would turn to bloodshed. From ideological disputes to civil war. At first, the two sides were able to compromise. On November the 10th, the moderate SPD and the far-left USPD formed the Council of People's Deputies, a provisional government with Friedrich Ebert of the SPD and Hugo Haase of the USPD as equal co-chairs. No right-wing party members or members of the old elite were on the council. But a lot of people still supported the old regime in the judiciary and education, the civil service, and especially the military. And that in particular would prove fatal for the young republic. But before we get to that, what happened to the Kaiser? After he was forced to abdicate, Wilhelm II went into exile in the Netherlands. He renounced his claim to the throne and never set foot on German soil again. And how did World War I end? On November the 8th, a German delegation arrived in the French town of Compiègne, where they were presented with the Allies' armistice terms. The conditions were severe and very different from what many Germans expected based on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. But there was little room for discussion. The Germans were allowed to raise minor technical points and formally register objections, but the terms were not up for negotiation. Under the armistice, Germany had to hand over large amounts of military equipment, withdraw from all occupied territories, surrender its fleet, and accept Allied occupation of the Rhineland. The Allied naval blockade would also continue. The German delegation, led by politician Matthias Erzberger, signed the armistice on November 11, 1918. That day, at 11 a.m., the armistice came into effect. The war that had killed more than 10 million people and wounded around 20 million was finally over.
It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go.
While Paris, London, and New York celebrated victory with jubilant crowds, the mood in Germany was very different. Germans felt a mix of relief that the killing had stopped, shock at the sudden defeat, and humiliation over the harsh armistice terms. The country was in the midst of a revolution. Millions were starving due to the ongoing blockade, and political chaos reigned. The crowds took to the streets, not in celebration, but to make the revolution happen.
A lot of contemporaries write at this time about, they use natural metaphors to describe what's happening. It's like an earthquake. The emperor has collapsed, and it's the crowds that drive that earthquake. One is that the Kaiserreich was, a house of cards, and you only need to move one card at the bottom for the whole thing to collapse. And it's the crowds that do that. So they're both this political space for making the revolution happen, but also for deciding what the revolution will become.
In mid-December, revolutionary councils from across Germany met at the Reich Congress of Workers' and Soldiers' Councils. Most of them voted in favor of parliamentary democracy. They decided to hold elections for a national assembly on January the 19th, 1919. At Christmas, the revolution that had started off largely bloodless turned violent when government-loyal army units clashed with revolutionary sailors in Berlin. Friedrich Ebert sent in more troops. The clashes killed dozens, including civilians. They also shattered hopes of a united socialist front. By relying on military force, Ebert alienated many workers and soldiers and deepened the rift between the moderate Social Democrats and the radical left.
What I think happens is that the political order breaks down and violence becomes a communicative tool whereby it's used to demonstrate messages that order will be restored. And that allows for the atrocities to take place.
In early January, tensions reached a breaking point. On January the 5th, 1919, the far left launched an uprising in Berlin, aiming to overthrow the provisional government and establish a socialist republic. Among them were the Spartacus League, the revolutionary group co-founded by Karl Liebknecht. For a week, fierce battles raged in the streets. The government, determined to restore order, deployed the army and the Freikorps. They were a paramilitary group of former soldiers.
On the other hand, there are very few other troops available. So what the government, the provisional government at this particular point in time says it is doing is that it's using, yes, anti-democratic, anti-republican, quite violent forces, however, to safeguard what they think is the achievements of the revolution.
Their intervention was brutal. More than 150 insurgents were killed, and by January the 12th, the uprising was crushed. Spartacus leaders Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht went into hiding. But on January the 15th, members of a vigilante group hunted them down. Soldiers shot Liebknecht in the Tiergarten Park. Luxemburg was shot in a car. Her body was thrown into a canal where it wasn't found for months.
We could say it was the original sin of the Weimar Republic. It was an enormous mistake to hand over the keys to safeguarding the Republic to the Freikorps, who were paramilitary groups with an ultra-nationalist, militarist ideology, often steeped in Völkisch thinking, that is, ethnic, racial nationalism, and above all, who celebrated a culture of violence and believed that the physical elimination of political adversaries was not just acceptable, but a duty, since all traitors had to be killed.
The communists would never forget that the Social Democrats allowed right-wing extremists to kill their comrades. But the defeat of the Spartacus League sealed the fate of the German Revolution. The new republic would stay under the leadership of moderate forces. The cost was deep political polarization and a legacy of violence that would haunt Germany for years to come. On January 19th, 1919, Germans went to the polls to elect their new National Assembly. Although overshadowed by the violence of the previous weeks, it was a big day for Germany. It was Germany's first election in which women could vote and stand for office. Voter turnout was remarkably high, with 83% of eligible voters participating. The election resulted in 423 deputies being elected, including 37 women, with 4 more joining later as replacements. The SPD won 37.9%, the largest share of the vote, but still not an absolute majority. They formed the Weimar Coalition with the Catholic Center Party and the German Democratic Party, the DDP. Notably, the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD, boycotted the election.
In this way, Germany became one of the first countries in the world to grant women full voting rights, doing so before France, the United Kingdom, or the United States, for example.
The National Assembly first met on February the 6th, 1919. It acted as Germany's interim parliament and drafted a new constitution. Because the political situation in Berlin was still unstable, the delegates convened in the city of Weimar, a quiet cultural center associated with the likes of the great German poet Goethe. This new Germany would become known as the Weimar Republic. A year later, on June the 6th, 1920, elections were held for a permanent parliament. The German Revolution had transformed the country from an authoritarian monarchy into a parliamentary democracy. But still not everyone accepted Germany's new democratic order, or its defeat in World War I. The revolution's achievements were soon under attack, the target of one of the most poisonous lies in German history. The stab-in-the-back myth. The war between Germany and the Allied powers officially ended in June 1919, with Germany forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles. It imposed even harsher terms than the armistice. Germany would have to pay massive reparations and give up territory. These conditions further destabilized the young republic and fueled resentment across the country. Now remember Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the two military commanders who shifted responsibility for Germany's defeat? They also started spreading a lie about why Germany lost, known as the stab-in-the-back myth. The conspiracy theory claimed that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield at all, but instead was betrayed from within by Democrats, socialists, and Jews, who had supposedly started a revolution and signed a shameful armistice. After all, how else could Germany have lost when German troops were still fighting on foreign soil when the war ended?
For some sections of society, not a small one, this myth explained what had just happened, because they had no access to other forms of explanation, and because those who could have explained better, high-ranking military personnel, decided not to, and decided to help propagate this myth.
Of course, it was a complete lie. Germany's military had been defeated. Ludendorff himself demanded the armistice. The revolution came after Germany's military collapsed, not before. But the timing of events, with a republic declared just days before the armistice was signed, created confusion. And that confusion helped the myth to spread. The consequences were catastrophic. The stab-in-the-back myth delegitimized the new Weimar Republic. It led to political assassinations, and ultimately fueled the Nazis' rise to power. The aftermath and consequences of the revolution. From the very start, the Weimar Republic was burdened with political unrest and an economy that suffered under the weight of Germany's high war reparations. Then came a global financial crisis, the Great Depression. By the early 1930s, the initial enthusiasm for the Republic had long faded. A situation that the Nazis used to their advantage. The democratic era that had started with so much hope and so little violence came to a brutal end when the Nazis rose to power in 1933. The Nazis hated the Weimar Republic, and they wanted to rewrite the meaning of November the 9th, the day of the Democratic Revolution. In 1923, Hitler launched a failed coup on that day, the Munich Beer Hall Putsch. And 15 years later, in 1938, it was the day of the Nazis' first major campaign of violence against German Jews, known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. It's not clear how much of that is a coincidence, but what is clear is that November the 9th now has many meanings in Germany, 2 of them linked to the Nazis. And that's why it's seen as unsuitable for a German public holiday. So, what remains of the German Revolution of 1918 and 1919?
The revolution creates a democracy which actually is not doomed from the start, and which attempts to find a way to organize a society in a modern industrial country which does not always end in antagonism, rivalry, and class conflict. So it's an experiment. How can a modern society exist? In the 1920s, women and men should be equal. How can we do this for the first time? Nobody's tried to do this as a political structure before. So that's the achievement of the Constitution. It just creates conditions for the Weimar experiment to happen.
It changed Germany in a quite extraordinary way and at an extraordinary speed. The revolution eventually brought the war to an end, got rid of the monarchy. The revolution created, in the end, then parliamentary democracy with the National Assembly and everything that the Weimar Constitution.
So Germany had a democracy and lost it when the Nazis came to power. It took many years to build back some of those key freedoms. What can that teach us today? We're looking forward to your answers in the comments.